How's it going, everyone? This is Anthro back again with another episode. And today we're going to be discussing BRICS, multipolarity, and the US's hypothetical response. So as BRICS reshapes the global order, could a neo-imperial US strategy restore its dominance? Imagine the US annexing Canada, Greenland, Mexico, and Panama. What would happen? Today we'll explore BRICS's rise, how it challenges the US hegemony, and the hypothetical scenario inspired by Donald Trump's recent rhetoric to counter this shift. As many of you have been aware, Trump has been discussing for a while now the upcoming economic war that he plans to put on the BRICS nations, as well as with tariffs. And he has been floating around rhetoric of annexing some of the United States' closest neighbors. And that is the basis of this discussion. So first, I'd like to start by discussing the shift away from the unipolar hegemonic control of the United States in the post-war era to a new multipolar world facilitated by the BRICS Cooperative. And the BRICS Cooperative is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, respectively. Now, since 2014, they have been growing and have received several new members. We'll discuss some of the strengths of the old members as well as some of the advantages the new members bring to the table. First up in the founding members, we have China, which is an absolute financial powerhouse, being the second largest economy in the world as of 2025 and growing. They are leading in manufacturing with over 30% of global output. They are also a technological innovation powerhouse with AI and 5G, and through their Belt and Road Initiative, they have taken a significant step in global infrastructure development, whether it's in Africa or the Southern Asian region. Next up, you have Russia, which is a military power, and they're also an energy superpower with the world's largest natural gas reserves and significant oil production. That oil production, in fact, is what has been keeping them in the fight financially during the Ukraine war, as the United States and Europe has put crippling sanctions on their economy. Next up, you have India, which is a tech and pharmaceutical giant, leading all global vaccine production with 50%. They also generate $245 billion annually from their IT ventures. Next is Brazil. Brazil is an agricultural powerhouse and giant with exports of soybean, beef, and coffee, and producing 3.8 million barrels of oil a day. In South Africa, we have a long-time mining and minerals giant producing platinum, chromium, and gold in large quantities. They've been mining diamonds since the 1800s, and they're an essential link to the African market. So that rounds out the original members of BRICS. Some of the new members that have come onto the scene include Iran, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia. So let's see what some of these newer members can bring in terms of advantages to the BRICS Cooperative. So beginning with the new members, let's start with Saudi Arabia. As everyone knows, Saudi Arabia is an absolute giant in OPEC and oil production and an energy leader, giving them some of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the entire world. They currently produce 10.5 million barrels of oil per day, and they add significant energy dominance to the BRICS Cooperative. Next up, you have the UAE, which is a financial hub and also with a significant sovereign wealth fund, totaling about $1 trillion with substantial investments in renewable energies. They also have oil, but not to the extent that the Saudis do. Next, you have Iran, which controls the Strait of Hormuz, which is a vital shipping strait for oil from the Middle East. And it is the second largest natural gas producer in the world with large reserves. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, which moves about 12% of global trade and is a critical choke point in the entire world. And then finally, Ethiopia, which has significant hydropower potential with its Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project. Strategically located in the Horn of Africa, it also provides regional inroads for China and other partners to have markets in the northern and Eastern African region. So some key takeaways about the BRICS formation and their group as a collective are their 41% of global trade, including 40% of the global energy production, and having 42% of the world's population within their borders, respectively. They also have a combined GDP, or will have a combined GDP, of about $30 trillion. So this is nothing insignificant. This has ramifications for changing the entire order of the world into a more multipolar world, which hasn't been roughly seen since before the colonial era. So I think that is part of why the BRICS nations, and particularly the older member states of the BRICS nations, created the formation to begin with. Not only simply to get from under the United States' financial control with SWIFT and sanctions and the IMF, the World Bank, etc., but to implement their own vision of political sovereignty in their respective regions of the world. Throughout the years, the topic of losing global dominance has been a big part of the United States' discussion in the public discourse. And what we have seen as of recently with Donald Trump's rhetoric involving annexation or purchases of American neighbors has some significance to it, even though it sounds outlandish. There is precedent for, of course, colonialism and annexation by the United States and other global powers in such a way. Likewise, the building of the BRICS cooperative gives impetus for the United States to explore such a concept. Now, it is hypothetical because the means of doing so are quite difficult in a successful way without there being a significant global backlash. However, I would still like to explore this hypothetical and go into depths about what the addition of these annexed or colonized, or however you want to address them, members would be to the United States. So without further ado, let's begin. Now, if the United States actually were to annex or purchase or however acquire our neighbors, it would add a significant boon to the energy and manufacturing capabilities the United States already enjoys. Some of the things and ways that it can do so are by adding the 168 billion barrels of oil reserves that Canada currently has, as well as its vast natural gas supplies. Greenland has 38.5 million metric tons of rare earth metals, which would challenge China's monopoly on the same notion and the same amount of minerals. Mexico is a production powerhouse in terms of oil, as well as silver, copper, and gold. And so that can complement our already vast reserves in terms of energy. When we're discussing manufacturing, we can look towards Mexico again, which produces 3.1 million vehicles annually. In fact, many of American branded cars come from Mexico, as well as electronics, with them exporting $80 billion worth of electronics that rival China. Finally, you have Canada's aerospace sector, which is generating $25 billion annually. So when you take these into consideration, it definitely increases the United States' capabilities significantly in manufacturing and the energy sectors. Finally, you have the trade parity. You would have control of the Panama Canal, which handles about 4% of global trade, rivaling the Suez situation with Egypt and the BRICS. And then the Arctic would be opened further with Canadian and Greenlandic territories, challenging Russia's coastal might and strength in the newly opening Arctic sea routes, with climate change making those things a new reality. So the quantitative comparison with the BRICS shows that the United States would generate a GDP of $35 trillion, have oil reserves of 176 billion barrels, and $3.5 trillion in manufacturing output alone. This brings the BRICS situation into the picture, with a $30 trillion GDP and 40% of all global trade. Manufacturing would be held by China and India respectively, and they would have dominance there. So this puts us in the position of having a very, very significant competition between both blocs, with China and Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and their new members versus a combined United States, Canada, Greenland, Panama, and Mexico. So this is a battle of giants, so to speak. So let's talk about the plausibility of this. So this would obviously cause a stir in the global community, as those nations are their own sovereign territories and are subject to their own jurisdictions, as well as the rule of law system that, ironically, the United States created and maintains most in the world would be in violation if such actions were to take place hostilely or coercively. Purchases can happen, but if they're not for sale, as Denmark is saying about Greenland, then it can't happen. So here are some of the things that would prevent that. Some of the legal and political barriers are annexation violates international law, like I already mentioned, and you would have resistance from Canada, Mexico, and Greenland that can lead to insurgencies, right? Because not just the governments, but some of their people and their populations would not want that themselves. There are many proud, patriotic people of all nations. Then there's the economic costs of doing so. Integrating economies like Greenland and Mexico would require trillions of dollars in infrastructure and social spending in terms of integrating culturally, as they speak either indigenous languages, mostly in the case of Greenland, or in the case of Mexico and Panama, Spanish, which is a significant language here in the United States, but nonetheless would have to become something of an official capacity. Then there's the geopolitical risks. These aggressive moves can unite BRICS in a militaristic alliance and other global South nations against the United States and their largely growing hegemonic power, extremely large hegemonic power, if such a hypothetical were to take place, accelerating a shift to greater multipolarity, or even a duopole world like we saw in the Cold War era, if such an alliance were to become an official capacity. Then there are the ethical dilemmas. Such actions would tarnish America's reputation for being the leader in the rule of law, establishing itself as the global hegemon and the moral bastion that it sees itself as, or tries to portray itself as in the current climate geopolitically. This would undoubtedly have effects on the sanctity or the sacred notion of democracy and sovereignty of nations, giving BRICS more moral high ground than the United States is already faltering moral position given its stance on Israel. So, in such a matchup, who holds the advantage? In my opinion, I think it would be BRICS. That would be due to the collaborative versus coercive approaches and differences between the two blocs. So BRICS emphasizes inclusivity and a shared growth model uniting nations across energy, manufacturing, and trade, whereas the US's situation in that hypothetical would be a form of neo-imperialism, which would rely on coercion or force and risking a global backlash and long-term instability. The strategic synergies that would occur from this would be the BRICS controls key resources in energy, rare earth metals, markets like China and India for manufacturing, and strategic trade routes with Suez, the Belt and Road Initiative, and a large section of the Arctic trade route. There's alternative financial models that they are instituting as well, away from the SWIFT banking model and the IMF World Bank dominated models, with the AIIB and the new development banks, which would be a direct challenge to the Western-dominated institutions. In this regard, I think that the BRICS would be seen as a voluntary force, whereas the United States would be an involuntary force in that regard. In summation, then you will have a situation where the BRICS is seen as more advantageous, as they would be a more voluntary force, having some newer members who are not aligned with either the BRICS currently or the United States to join the BRICS, as they would be more inclined to be democratic and respecting the sovereignty of those states. It would also be a time for many states since the colonial project to exercise their sovereignty on a global stage and not have to be beholden to the hegemonic status of the United States or the European partners. So this would help to give the reputation of cooperativity in the multipolar vision that the BRICS nations are having, in contrast to a hypothetical annexation by Trump, which would just conjure memories of a unilateral imperialistic system. And this would pose the question now, do you think the US can compete with the BRICS without resorting to these imperialistic strategies? And what role should innovation and diplomacy play in shaping the future? This is obviously a more realistic situation, as Trump has said, and it will happen, where the United States will try to compete, or not try, will definitely compete with the BRICS nations in various arenas, especially technological and energy-focused arenas, as those are going to be the drivers of all global society moving forward into the 22nd century. So, if you found this analysis insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth breakdowns of global geopolitics with a little bit of my analysis in there. Thank you once again for watching AnthroBro. Peace.